We've assembled what I really think is a blue chip group of experts today on term limits, people for them, people opposed to them, some polling data, and so I am very pleased to be part of this, and thank you all for spending part of your day with us today. With that, I want to introduce the Democratic candidate for Lieutenant Governor, a man who is no stranger in this community, Paul Vallis, to talk about their position, the Quinn Vallis ticket's position on this issue. Paul?
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be here. Let me, first of all, I had the pleasure of working for Dawn Clark Netsch for 10 years, and there's two things we did disagree on. It was term limits and, of course, the new the convention, if you remember, a few years ago, there was the push to have another convention, and it's the only thing, it's the only two things that we agreed upon. But of course, Dawn always articulated her arguments for things much better than me, so there's no way I'm going to compete. But if Dawn were here now, she would say, "You have term limits. It's called elections." and when you remove the obstacles to people going out and voting and expressing themselves, that's the ultimate term limit. But as you know, Governor Quinn has been an advocate for term limits for a long time. He actually was successful in getting a referendum on the ballot that was of course overturned by the courts. So he's really made a push for term limits on at least two prior occasions. One with the 8 is enough, I think back in 1994, and then of course one of the arguments that we made, because he actually invited me to a press conference at the time I was doing school rebuilding and reconstruction in New Orleans, and he called me up, and I came up to the Allegro, and we had a press conference advocating for the referendum to have a constitutional convention. Constitution has that provision where you can call a constitutional convention. And one of the arguments that we made is with the Constitutional Convention, you could address a whole host of issues, from term limits to pension reform to government reorganization, et cetera, to real ethics reform. And of course, he was one of the lone wolves out there. But he has been very, very, very consistent. And his effort on behalf of term limits was actually just another effort in his advocacy for kind of the grassroots democratic approach to basically reforming government from the outside. If you remember his coalition for political honesty and his efforts to the cutback amendment, and of course his successful efforts in removing that provision in the statutes that actually allowed legislators to take 2 years' salary the first year of their new term. That was interesting. And then, of course, later on, the Citizens Utility Board. So his advocacy on these issues has been long-serving, but he has remained and will remain a strong advocate of term limits, and it's an advocacy that he embarked upon early on, and he continues to support it. Thank you.
Sure. I'd like to, what we want to do today is to save plenty of time for questions from the audience, so we'll certainly entertain a few of those. Okay. I don't think we have microphones around the auditorium, do we? I can't see. I guess not. We'll have to make sure we repeat the question.
Okay.
So I'll go ahead and let you field the question. I wondered if you had any thoughts about term limits at the local level. Should that be something that's done here in Illinois, Paul?
Well, I've always been torn on that issue, while supporting term limits in general, in part because there is certainly a justification, or one can understand people's frustration with the process and the feeling that the process is not a process that has been delivering in terms of its advocacy for the real needs of the public. I think that the more we restrict democracy, and the more we restrict individuals' rights to basically choose who will represent their interests, I think if you go to an extreme where you're doing it at the local level, I mean, what's the next step? Local municipal mayors, local trustees, local board, school board members. I think you can certainly go overboard. I certainly think there's a case to be made, and the governor's made that case in the past for term limits for state office holders. But I can't speak for him. I would not advocate for local term limits. I think ultimately we can attack the broader issues through stronger ethic laws. When the governor was elected, one of the first things he did was he was instrumental in the passage of a very strong ethics law that not only focused on a whole host of issues, including campaign finance reform, for that matter, creating a referendum process by which governors who were indicted or governors who had been convicted of certain crimes could be recalled. I think greater transparency, greater restrictions, setting up a process by which legislative districts can be drawn in ways that are balanced and truly create districts that are not simply drawn for political reasons, but drawn in the best interest of the one man, one vote, one woman, one vote concept. I think that's really I think that's where you attack the broader challenges. People talk about things like, is an elected school board better than mayoral control? It all depends on who's on the elected school board, and it all depends on who's the mayor. And I'm not making value judgments on anything. The reality is you need more than just term limits to ensure that you're going to have the right behavior. You need more than term limits to ensure that you're going to have truly representative and responsibly representative government. And I think you need to go beyond term limits, and you need to look at even strengthening the current ethic laws that we have on the books, ethics laws on the books, and I think we need to build upon the successes that we've seen in the past few years in getting stronger ethic laws on the books. And I think transparency and more restrictions on campaign financing, initiatives out there to create an objective, non-political mechanism for drawing legislative districts. I think that, in my personal opinion, not the governor's position, my personal opinion, would go a long way towards addressing the issues that obviously the public wants to address. Okay.
We do have house microphones here. Bob, do you have a?
Is this live? Can you hear?
Yes.
Great. This gentleman here had a question.
I feel like I'm being interrogated
Yeah.
with the big light.
It is hard for us to see here at the front, so.
Hold on.
All right. Yes, sir. I can let you call.
Okay, great.
It seems to me that there are a number of downsides for term limits, and they're well known, but it seems to me that the real problem is seniority, the length of time the leadership is in office, committee chairmanships, leaders of the House and Senate. Wouldn't it be better to address how committee chairs are chosen, how leaders are chosen, and maybe give them term limits for leadership positions?
Well, some have advocated for that. I think the term limit approach is viewed by some as a simpler, less complicated way to basically address the issue of people being in positions of leadership for an extended period of time without the perception of accountability. I'm not suggesting that there isn't any accountability. I agree with Don Clark-Netsch. At the end of the day, Tony Preckwinkle says we live in democracy is the best form of government, but the most fragile form of government, meaning if you don't participate, the government does not work effectively. It's a participatory democracy, unfortunately. So the importance of not removing obstacles to full participation, to full public participation, finding ways to get people more involved, and I think transparency has a lot to do with it. I think that's important. That's the key. I would certainly, just as I've been a supporter of term limits, I would certainly be a supporter of other ways to limit individuals' longevity in positions of responsibility. But at the end of the day, it's still going to fall short unless you have these other things in place. And I think the governor, through his strong advocacy of the strengthening of the ethics law, was certainly a step in the right direction. I think further things need to happen, and and I also think the proposals out there, like proposals to create an independent entity to, in effect, in the future, draw legislative maps and things like that, would also certainly be a step in the right direction. Oh, yes.
That's my name is David Smith, and I'm just trying to figure out today why term limits on the local level. I believe that it would be a good thing based on the fact that you have a lot of people from the community that really don't know involvement on not mentioning precinct captains because of the fact that the information doesn't really trickle down to them as far as who to vote for until they get actually outside the voting booth or outside the door of the vote for the poll, and it's usually along political line. So what I'm trying to find out now is that with term limits, is this going to be something that's going to be brought out into the community so that the average person will be able to understand before they get to the polling place?
Well, I think, and those are great questions. I think the issue of term limits at the local level is certainly an issue worth exploring, but what's on the table, and let's face it, what's on the ballot, and part of the reason, or part of the reason for this discussion, part of the reason we're having the forum is because in a political season, term limits has become, a subject, it's to put term limits on the ballot for whatever motivation. And it is interesting that some people who never took a position on term limits or advocated when Governor Quinn was out there trying to get his lonely referendums on the ballot for term limits, or even the Constitutional Convention. I remember there weren't a lot of people standing next to us, shoulder to shoulder, on those advocacy things. It's an election year, and that's the way the political system works. But I think the issue of the legislature coming in and imposing limits on local governments, I'm always reluctant to basically interfere with local governments, or being told or telling local governments what to do, or I think at the end of the day, local democracy is the best democracy, and I think allowing, not restricting individuals at the local level, not restricting people's rights to pick their own leaders at the local level how many times they want, is probably something I know that Dawn Clark-Netsch would advocate for, and on deeper consideration, I would probably be inclined to support too. So, but this is not going to be an issue that we're going to be addressing, certainly not on the referendum. I am a little confused that, the referendum also increases the size of one house and decreases the size of another house. I mean, if you have a term limit debate, have a term limit debate, up and down, address the issue of term limits on the current referendum, and then if you want to go further and discuss and debate the issue of limiting terms of mayors or limiting terms of local government officials, I think that can be the next step. As we all know, in this state, we kind of move, we kind of migrate. It's a gradual process, and a lot of times we try not to tackle too many issues at once, and term limits and the restriction and passing a referendum that's going to limit individual choice when it comes to selecting who their leader should be is not. It's certainly a controversial thing, and I think the first step would be to address it at the state level, and then obviously to have a continued debate on the issue of whether or not it should be extended to the local level. That would be my inclination right now. Okay.
I think we've got another question? One more?
Yes. Thank you, sir. My name is Woodruff Thompson, and my question is this. I know that Mr. Ballas has been around a long time, and if you were an odds maker or an actuary, what do you believe realistically is the chances of getting this accomplished? In other words, term limits. Would it be in the lifetime of most people that are over 50?
Well, thank you for pointing out how old I am. As I mentioned when I went out to Moraine Valley Community College, The other day I said, I remember when I attended Marine Valley and they were in the Quonset huts. You know, if I were a betting person, and this is my personal opinion, I think there's a good chance that term limits will probably end up on the ballot. And I believe it's on the ballot. I think there's an even better chance that term limits would probably be approved if I were a betting person. But I'm not a betting person, fortunately. So, you know, so I think there's probably a good chance, obviously, that we may, the public may deal with the issue this year, this election year. Okay?
Paul, your minders tell me that you have time for just one more question, and then you
I'm
have
my
to
minder.
be on your way. So, is there one final question? No? Everybody? Paul, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
We're pleased today to have some of the leading national experts on term limits questions with us. Dr. Carl Kurtz has been with the National Conference of State Legislatures in Denver since its inception in the 1970s. He and another one of our speakers, Chris Mooney, really are some of the nation's leading experts on these questions, how they work, do they work, what are states doing. So we're really pleased that Dr. Kurtz has made the trek here from Denver to be with us this morning. Dr. Carl Kurtz.
It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today, coming from Denver, Colorado, the headquarters of the National Conference of State Legislatures. NCSL is a national organization of all of the 7,383 state legislators in the United States and their roughly 25,000 staff people. And a lot of people ask, well, what does your organization do? And the best answer I can give to that is we do exactly what we're doing here. Hundreds of times a day, our phone rings or we get an email message saying, I want to introduce a bill in my state to do X. What's the experience of other states with similar legislation? Well, X in this instance happens to be term limits. And we do know something about that as a result of a national study that we did, and that's what I'm here to share with you today. Let me say at the outset, I don't normally favor a gangster look, but I opened up my bag this morning and discovered that I had failed to pack a shirt. And so I'm wearing the same shirt that I wore on the airplane here yesterday. So apologies for my informality. So term limits. There are 15 states today that have term limits. At one point, there were 21. Between 1990 and 2000, 21 of the 24 states that have the initiative enacted term limits, almost the entire universe. The three that did not, in two of them they were defeated in Mississippi and North Dakota, and in one, Illinois, it was ruled off the ballot, not allowed to be on the ballot by the Supreme Court, and you'll be hearing much more about that as the day goes on. So virtually the entire universe of states with the initiative enacted them. In six of those states, the term limit measures were repealed in 4 instances by the state courts, ruling them invalid based on state constitutional provisions, and in 2 instances where the term limits had been enacted by statute, the legislature repealed them before they went into effect. That was in Utah and in Idaho. In Idaho, there was an outcry against the legislature repealing those term limits, so there was a referendum placed on the ballot to invalidate what the legislature had done, and the voters rejected that. In other words, they upheld the legislature's decision to repeal term limits. So let's see. Oh, there's my, thought I did not have this. Okay, so these are the 15 states with term limits, and there are two key variables here when you look at the types of term limits. One is the length of the limit, and the other is whether the limit is a consecutive limit or a lifetime limit. A lifetime limit is one where once you've served your designated period of time, you can never come back to the legislature. The consecutive limits, on the other hand, it varies from state to state, but after a certain period of time of sitting out, 2 years, 4 years, it varies, you can come back to the legislature. So you can see here that the most common type of term limit among the 50 states is 8 years in the House and 8 years in the Senate. The key point about this slide, though, is that the type of term limit makes a big difference in terms of its impact. And if you look at the upper right corner of this slide, the Arkansas and Michigan have the most restrictive term limits, with 6 years in the House and 8 years in the Senate, and they are lifetime limits. And so just think for a minute, if you have a 6-year term limit in the House, then you by definition have a Speaker of the House, a chairman of your chairperson of your Appropriation Committee, or the key positions in the legislature are occupied by people who have a maximum of 4 years of experience in their last term of office. Contrast that with Louisiana down here in the category of 12 years in the House and 12 years in the Senate, and it's a consecutive limit. That's almost not a limit at all, because most legislators don't serve more than 12 years. Yes, a few do, and that increases the average, but the great majority of legislators don't spend more than 8 or 10 years in the legislature. So the point here is that the type of term limit makes a big difference. So these term limits were enacted between 1990 and 2000. They started in Oklahoma, followed a few months later by California and Colorado in November of 1990. This was the result of something of a national movement. It was a conservative-inspired movement as and in reaction to a strong sense of distrust. It was also, quite frankly, a Republican strategy. Remember that initially the term limits were aimed at Congress, and frustration with the Congress that was at that time dominated and had been for many years by Democrats. But the aim at Congress misfired in effect when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that states could not limit the terms of members of Congress. But that inspired the notion to continue on that, well, maybe if it were good for Congress, it would be good for state legislatures as well. And I think state legislatures were caught up in a lot of frustration with government at the national and federal level. So after these term limits were imposed and had had a few years of experience, we at NCSL determined that it would be very useful to do a national study of the impact of term limits. And we did that in conjunction with two other organizations, the Council of State Governments and the State Legislative Leaders Foundation, and a group of about a dozen political scientists from throughout the country, one of whom was Chris Mooney from here in Illinois, whom you'll hear from later on. In this study, we gathered a lot of aggregate data. I'm going to share some of that with you. We did a survey of all state legislators in the nation, which then allowed us to compare the attitudes, the approaches, the systems of legislatures in term-limited states to the ones in non-term limited states. And then we also did more intensive case studies of 9 states. 6 of them were term-limited states, and you'll see which ones they were in a moment. And 3 of them were non-term limited states because we wanted some kind of control. We wanted to make sure that whatever changes we were observing in the term limited states were due to term limits and not to some other factors. And actually one of the 3 control states, non-term limited states that we looked at was Illinois. And Chris Mooney was the leader of that Illinois case study. So let's just get to some of this data. Here you see a slide that shows the turnover of the membership of legislatures. The upper one that's in blue that maybe you can't distinguish from the back of the room is the upper one when you get to the right-hand side is the term-limited states showing rates of 35–40% turnover being routine in the term-limited states, and the non-term limited states there in the dotted red line, much lower, 15 or 20% difference after term limits were imposed. So when you look at this slide, you can see over on the left-hand side, before term limits, there was virtually no difference among these states in the rate of turnover of the membership. This is House of Representatives only, it doesn't include Senates. And then during that term limit enactment period from 1990 to 2000, during that period of time, the measures start to diverge, and you end up with about, on average, an 18-point differential in the rate of turnover of the members. So very clearly, what you're seeing here is a difference in levels of experience between term-limited states and non-term limited states. This is a little bit different look at it. Here, this is the percentage of members in each chamber who have served at least 5 years in the legislature. And so the top line in green is the non-term limited states. The middle line is the 8-year limits, which remember I said that's the most common. And then at the bottom is the 6-year term limit states. So this measure is at the time that a term begins. So the striking thing here is in those 6-year limit states, Arkansas and Michigan, they don't have any members unless they came over from the other chamber. They don't have any members with 5 years of experience at the start of their last term. So, and we'll talk about some of the implications of that in a moment. So this slide shows something that political scientists have dubbed the Burkean shift. For those of you who remember your political science, your political theory, you remember that Edmund Burke was the member of parliament from England who famously drew the distinction between legislators who regarded their responsibility as representing their constituents and reflecting their views versus a delegate role where the members used their own judgment much more than they did their constituents' point of view. So this slide shows, we asked a question in one of our surveys, legislators today compared to a decade ago spend much less time or much more time on each one of these aspects of their job. And this is a scale of 1 from much less time to 5, much more time. So on each one of these measures, sending out mailings, seeking district projects, solving constituent problems, and talking to constituents, the term-limited states scored lower than the non-term limited states. So the quick summary here is that while these are not huge differences, they are statistically significant differences that show that legislators in term-limited states tend to spend less time serving their constituents, paying attention to their constituents, than the ones in term-limited states. And there's actually a logical reason for this. One of the claims of the advocates of term limits at the very beginning was that we will get much more competitive elections as a result of term limits. Well, that turns out not to be true at all, because a person who is ambitious for office, who would like to serve in a term-limited states, that there's no incentive for them to take on an incumbent. Because they know that all they have to do is wait 4 years, 6 years, and then that seat will be open, and it's a much easier job to win an open seat than it is to contest an incumbent. So contesting of elections has actually gone down under term limits, and I think that's the explanation of this slide about the Burkean shift. So another natural result of the reduced level of experience that I showed in those previous slides, here's another one where the question was, legislators today compared to a decade ago are much less knowledgeable or much more knowledgeable on a scale from 1 to 5 on committee issues, on legislative process issues, and on statewide policy issues. And again, here the differences are more obvious, also statistically significant, that the legislators in term-limited states are less knowledgeable. So a further extension of experience, kind of a complicated slide here. So this shows movement from the House to the Senate in each one of those 3 categories. And you see a very significant increase in the states with either 6-year or 8-year limits in the frequency with which members move from the House to the Senate. This is an important slide from the standpoint of that my original point about the type of term limit makes a difference. I should have mentioned to you on that very first slide where we showed Arkansas and Michigan up in the upper right quadrant of 6-year term limits in the House and 8 years in the Senate and lifetime limits. Well, it used to be up until 6 months ago that California was also in that category. But California in November of, 18 months ago. California in November of 2012 enacted a change in their term limits to go to 12 years regardless of what chamber you have served in. And that had a very significant impact on the incentive structure, or we think it has. It's yet to be seen. In California, it had come to be that 95% of the members of the Senate had previously served in the state assembly, which is what they call their lower house of representatives. And so the Senate over time had gained an advantage over the House. They were the repository of experience and knowledge. And so there was an imbalance in the legislature in California, and they are heavily represented in those high slides there, showing movement from the high bars, showing that movement from House to Senate. So what's changed in California is the incentive structure for legislators who want to gain influence and power within the legislature. The incentive now is not to move from the House to the Senate as quickly as possible, but rather to serve out some time in one chamber and advance to gain seniority, maybe to become speaker, to become chair of a committee. This one has to do with the experience of House speakers in term-limited legislatures. And here you're looking at the 6 states that were part of our intensive case studies: Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Maine, and Ohio. And again, pretty much by definition, you impose term limits, you're going to very significantly decrease the experience level of the top leader of the legislature. We would show the same thing with committee chairs. You know, I said earlier that typically legislators don't serve more than 8 or 10 years in the legislature, except that there are always a few who do. And they are the experienced hands, the knowledgeable ones, and they gravitate toward the leadership positions that make a difference in the legislature. So here's another complicated but important slide, and it shows the power shifts over 10-year periods of time in our 6 term-limited states and our 3 non-term limited control states. And so anything below 0 here on this is a gain in power for the executive in relation to the legislature. Anything above 0 is a gain for the legislature. And here you can see that in all but one of the 6 term-limited states, there were significant gains for the governor and state agencies, but I'm going to focus primarily here on the governor in relation to the legislature. The one exception was Ohio, and in some ways it's an exception that proves the rule, in that at the time that we were doing this study, Ohio had a relatively weak governor, and while term limits had mostly taken effect, there were a top leader in the Senate and a top leader in the House who had been very, very effective leaders, and they still had a little bit of time left. And so there was this wide perception that the Ohio legislature had gained power in relation to the governor at the time that we were doing that study. Now look at each of the control states, where during the same period of time in 2 of those states there were small gains for the legislature in relation to the governor, and in one, Kansas, a small decline. So this is one of the key points about our study of the impact of term limits, which is that in relation to the executive branch, the legislature is weakened by the imposition of term limits. Now, some of you maybe are going to ask, well, governors are term limited, and aren't they? And in fact, There are more states with term limits for governors, usually 2 4-year terms, than there are term limits for legislatures. But you have to think about the difference between the division of labor and the source of expertise for governors versus legislatures. Governors stand at the top of a huge pyramid of experts in state government policy. They have thousands of people in their Department of Natural Resources, in their Department of Health and Human Services, in their education departments. And all of those people are feeding the information to the governor. And if you place term limits on the governor, it really affects only one person at the top, or his or her immediate cadre of policy advisors. It doesn't affect all the other sources of information that governors have available to them. With the legislature, on the other hand, it's this very, very flat structure with, in most states between 100 and 250 legislators, each one of whom is equal. And yes, they do have a staff, but it's a very, very small staff in relation to the size of the executive branch. And so what the legislature relies on for expertise is the members themselves. And typically legislatures divide up the labor, and members become experts in specific policy areas. And so it's the people who actually get term limited in the legislature who are the source of its expertise. So I would argue that term limits have a much bigger impact on the legislature than they do on the governor. And I see Governor Edgar here, and maybe he will argue that one way or another later on today. So let me just try to summarize the key findings of our national study. First of all, that term limits vary in their impact based on the type of limit and the type of legislature, that the more professionalized legislatures, the more year-round legislatures have had, like California or Michigan or Florida, or Ohio, have had greater impact. The term limits have had a greater impact on them than they have on the more classic citizen legislatures on our list of term-limited states like Maine or Montana or South Dakota. The loss of experienced legislators has meant less knowledge of substantive issues, less institutional knowledge, and in our study we actually found that they were more chaotic legislatures. They were legislatures that were just difficult for leaders to control, and more difficult to obtain consensus and agreement. One thing I haven't talked about yet is that there was, interestingly, no effect on who gets elected. Again, this was one of the key points of the advocates of term limits. If we have term limits, we'll get more women, we'll get more minorities, and we'll get a younger membership. In fact, that did not occur. There's no difference, both before and after term limits, in the representation of women, and between term limited and non-term limited states. With minorities, there's also not a significant difference. There was some very significant change in California, Arizona, and Colorado after the imposition of term limits. There was a major increase in Latino representation in the legislature. But that was due to population changes and other political changes more than it was to term limits. Term limits might have slightly accelerated the growth of representation, particularly in California, of Latino legislators, but it was not the major cause of that. We talked about less attention to constituents, that Burkean effect, and we've talked about senates having more experience in relation to houses, not in every state, but in quite a few of the term-limited states. And lastly, that governors have gained significant power in relation to the legislature. So I'm going to come back here and wrap up in a moment, but before I do, I want to cover one other topic that I know is of interest here in Illinois, and that we had a question about a little earlier, and that has to do with limits on leaders' terms. And again, in our best NCSL fashion, we have a lot of comparative information here. And this table shows the states that have limits on leaders' terms, either 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, or 8 years, and whether this is done by custom, by tradition, or whether it is done by rule, and in only one instance in Maine in the House and Senate is it done by statute. So there are 15 chambers that do limit leaders' terms. Most of them, as you can see here, by custom. And in some ways, the most interesting ones here are the states that have the 2-year limits. The Florida House is perhaps the classic one. Florida has term limits, but their tradition of a 2-year limit on speakers of the House predates term limits. It's just something that they have always done. And it's a very interesting system, and it's interesting from the standpoint of what could happen if you impose term limits. The way they do it in Florida is they actually know they just a week ago elected the speaker who will become speaker in 2015 after this coming election. They also know who will be the speaker in 2017 and the speaker in 2019, because they line up and they gather pledges, and unless by some miracle the overwhelmingly Republican-dominated Florida legislature were to switch to the Democrats, they know who's going to be speaker in 2019. So this is just kind of an addendum that may be useful to you in your discussions moving forward here. So let me just conclude by saying that in a lot of ways, from my standpoint, where you come out on term limits depends on your biases to begin with. I am one who believes in a strong and effective legislative branch of government that is an independent and co-equal partner with the executive branch. And so my bias is against term limits, and because they weaken the legislature. But other people don't favor necessarily a strong, independent, co-equal branch of government. I remember when the term limit movement was first starting, I attended a seminar in Washington, D.C., put on by the Cato Institute that was advocating for these term limits. And after the speakers had all made their contributions, most there was kind of token opposition to it, mostly people in favor. Somebody in the audience raised their hand and said, but won't term limits weaken the legislature? And the president of the Cato Institute said, that's exactly the point. If you take the viewpoint that you want weak governmental institutions, then term limits certainly have an attraction, and I respect that. Well, having said all that, I guess I'm probably less concerned about term limits than I was back in the 1990s when I took public positions against it, in large part because I knew then and maybe didn't appreciate as much the notion that legislatures are highly adaptive institutions. They know how to roll with the punches of all different kinds, and term limits just happens to be one of those punches, maybe more a deflating one, but they do come back, they adapt, they change. Maybe they're weaker than they were, but they are still worthy institutions that continue on. So I'm glad to take any questions. Wait for the mic.
Hi, my name is Omid Manuelos, and first and foremost, I just want to appreciate your gangster attire. I like that. On your term limits provision slide, you have about 10 to 12 different conditions with different years of term limits, whether consecutive or lifetime limits. And I'm wondering, did you do an empirical analysis on the number of laws passed in these 12 different conditions and versus non-term limit states as a proxy for gridlock and partisanship?
Yeah.
Another condition controlling for all may equal economic growth in states that implemented certain type of term limits versus other types of term limits. And then finally, it seems like one of the major compelling interests in term limits is preventing the incidence of corruption. So I was wondering if the different types of term limits versus non-term limits lower the incidence of corruption or not in an empirical way. And I think, that gets beyond whether you think legislatures should be powerful or weak, and it gets to real data that can inform and drive what type of term limits, if in fact they are good.
Okay, so I heard three questions there. One is having to do with how many bills are passed by legislatures, another having to do with the content of that legislation, and then a third having to do with corruption. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So on the question of whether more or less legislation is passed, there's very little variation over time within states before and after term limits. And between states that have term limits and don't have term limits, there's no consistent explanation of the volume of legislation. In terms of the content of the legislation, that's a very, very difficult thing to analyze, especially the people who want to say, well, do they pass better legislation or do they pass worse legislation? Well, better and worse depends on your point of view. What I think is good legislation, you may think is very bad legislation, so there's very little objective way to do that.
I think just regarding the content, like the economic growth of the state overall.
Oh, okay.
Not specifically the type of laws they pass.
We did not look at that in our study. I think there is some literature on that, and maybe Chris Mooney, when he speaks, might be able to speak to that. And your last question about incidents of corruption, we did not look at that. I would say that trying to look across states at incidents of corruption and trying to even measure corruption is very, very difficult. I don't think that convictions are a very good measure. You got a whole bunch of variables between the role of the federal government, the state governments. It's very difficult to find causal elements there, but the short answer is we did not look at that, and I don't have data on that.
My name is Bob Costello. I'm actually the determinant committee here in Illinois. My question is, how did you measure the power shift? What variables were you looking at to determine that power shift?
Three things really. One was we had our national survey of all state legislators, and one of the questions we asked was the relative power of governors to legislatures, to what extent governors got their way in the legislature. And so we compared the survey responses from the non-term limited states to the term limited states. And then also in our 9 case study states, we did another survey where we asked expert observers of the legislature who had been there 10 years or more to compare the legislature before term limits and after term limits. And then we also did in those 9 case study states, we looked very hard at governor's use of veto power, governor's agenda, and how much of the agenda was passed by the legislature, and that kind of thing. So I gave you just one measure there, the survey from 10 years ago versus now, but we have a lot of other data showing that.
One more question.
Dr. Curtis, thank you. A question about you talked about the shift in power between the executive and legislative branches that your study would suggest is occurring. My question is, do you have any information, any data about what effect, if any, term limits have had on voter turnout in subsequent elections after term limits were imposed? The reason I ask the question is that term limits, to the extent that they are an institutional restraint on people's ability to serve, might lead voters to suggest, to think, well, not so much of a need to go out and throw the bums out because we have an automatic mechanism to do that. And I'm wondering whether there is any correlation you've observed between term limits, the imposition of term limits, and voter turnout.
Well, it's a nice theory. You're describing a very sophisticated voter there who makes that kind of calculation. The answer is no, we haven't looked at that, and frankly, I can't imagine there's much of any relationship. I don't think that term limits have any impact on voter turnout.
Time for just a couple more.
Susan Holloway. You may have already addressed this, but I didn't hear it. Is there any comparison as to the turnout of political parties when there are term limits? If that changes. Increases.
Okay, so you're looking at the partisan impact of term limits, is that the question? Again, there was no, we couldn't identify an independent impact of term limits on partisan change in those states. Whatever partisan change occurred was more due to other factors than it was to term limits. It was a time in the mid-1990s where Republicans were gaining significantly in their representation, and kind of like the minority, the Latino representation that I talked about earlier, there might be a little bit of an argument that having more open seats during term limits did somewhat accelerate Republican gains, but it was not the major factor. The major factor was much more national shifts and especially regional shifts in the South.
We have time for one more question, Senator.
Thank you. Will the National Conference of State Legislatures participate in opposition to the push for term limits in Illinois?
a hard one. We generally do not take positions on state issues. Historically, though, because of our belief, and one of our missions of NCSL is strengthening the legislature, we have spoken out against term limits in a general way, and I could imagine if the circumstances were right that we might do that again here in Illinois. But you know, I also said in my conclusion, I think we're probably less worried about them than we once were. So I'll give you, you know, sorry to be wishy-washy, but maybe would be my answer.
One last question from the moderator. Do you see, looking around the country, is there agitation like this in other states, or is Illinois unique here in this push now?
Well, in no place, in no state has term limits been enacted without the initiative. And in a couple of states, the legislature enacted the initiative, but it was because they saw the initiative coming and they were heading it off with a term limit that they preferred to what the advocates of term limits were doing. So essentially you have run the course of the states that have the initiative. They've all considered it and either done it one way or another, except for Illinois, where the Supreme Court intervened on it. There have been efforts to repeal term limits in a number of states by initiative. All of them have been shot down except for that one instance in Idaho I mentioned where the voters did uphold the legislature's decision to repeal term limits. The only other significant ballot activity or successful ballot activity was in California in 2012 where they changed the structure of the term limits. But in California, there had been several efforts to remove the term limits, and they went down in flames.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl. Carl's very graciously agreed to stick around for most of our program today, so those of you who did not get a chance to ask him questions can pull him aside. I apologize, Carl, for the interruption. Mr. Vallis' cell phone has been found, and he's well on his way. Our next speaker is Dr. Dick Simpson. Professor Simpson is well known to most of the people in this room. He has great experience both in the classroom and the academy, as well as a member of the Chicago City Council. So, Professor?
Jim, how are you? Seems like there are a lot of people opposed to term limits. I'm in favor of term limits. There are some very practical reasons in Illinois why we might favor term limits. Seems to me, for instance, two examples, Mike Madigan and Richard J. Daley, both served in office too long. Today, Mike Madigan rules the House, and maybe some say the state, with an iron fist. With the absolute power, he dishes out patronage jobs. He has absolute power over what passes and what doesn't pass in the state legislature. When I served under Mayor Richard J. Daley, who was mayor for more than 20 years, and I led the opposition bloc, Daley was the boss of Chicago, and what I noticed was he became ever more tyrannical the longer he was in office. He failed to deal with social issues like segregation and schools and youth protests when it was important for Chicago to do so. And these two examples aren't alone. Since 2001, 97% of state legislators have been reelected when they've run for office. Being elected to the state legislature isn't really an election, it's a coronation. In this year's primary, 74 of 137 incumbent legislators didn't even have an opponent on the ballot, and they only have token opposition in this fall election that's coming up. Term limits would serve to bring more citizen statesmen into Illinois government in the place of career politicians. This was the way it was with our founding fathers like Washington and Jefferson. They would serve in office for a few years, then they would go become regular citizens again. Some like Washington would retire, and others like Jefferson would come back to serve again in other offices. But they came back with a citizen's perspective, with having the same experience of every other person who lived in their district. Now, term limits would allow us to elect new people, and new people bring new perspectives, and they do bring minorities, and sometimes in the past we thought they brought more women to office. For instance, the important point made by the last speaker is it would result in more Latinos eventually being elected, as they deserve to be, because they are underrepresented in the state legislature. That doesn't always work out. Some of the newer evidence shows that women, in fact, don't move up as much as we had thought. Sometimes minorities don't, but it opens up the system. It begins to open up offices, and as the last speaker also said, it's much easier to win an office when you're not running against an incumbent. Term limits would also serve to break the link between lobbyists and politicians, and I believe they would help curb corruption. They're not a panacea. They won't make us have good government automatically, but they help. And remember, in Illinois, we are the third most corrupt state in the nation by DOJ statistics, and Chicago has the great honor of being the most corrupt city in the nation, which hardly anyone disputes. So for us, term limits have a special meaning and special importance. And just this last week, the Gallup poll released their major poll, which says we have a little work to do here in Illinois about restoring faith in government. How much? We are the worst state in the nation in terms of faith in our government. In Illinois, only 28% of our citizens have great faith or even a fair amount of faith in government and in government's ability to solve problems. By the contrast, even a state like Texas has 72% of its people thinking they have faith in their government. We can do better. The truth is, voters want term limits and politicians don't. As you will hear in the poll that's going to be released and discussed right after me, at least 60% of the voters not only want term limits, but want them strongly and are going to vote for them if they're on the ballot. And this goes across Democrats, Republicans, and independents. All of them strongly support term limits. Throughout the nation, as you heard in the last discussion, supporters of term limits have won 85% of the referendums to create them. Nearly half of the states at one time or another, and hundreds of towns and cities, including major cities like New York, have term limits. Very short. In Illinois, we're behind the curve on this particular issue. Now, people in office too long, not just the Madigans and the Daleys, lose touch with what it's like to be an average citizen. They no longer share the views of citizens that they are supposed to represent. When you're said, Senator so-and-so and Senator so-and-so and please, sir, and honorable, and all that stuff, you begin after a while to let it go to your head if all you ever do is serve in public office. Now, if the constitutional amendment to limit terms in our state legislature gets to the ballot, it's very clear it will pass. And it's also very clear there will be an enormous effort to try and keep it off the ballot by Mike Madigan and others in Springfield. What it would do if it passes is limit the terms in our state legislature to a total of 8 years beginning in 2015. And just yesterday, we found out again that there is no hope that our state legislature will pass any form of term limits. Yesterday, they killed a bill in the Senate that would have created a 10-year term limit in the state of Illinois. So if you think there's a better form of term limits, 12 years, 10 years, lifetime, not lifetime, whatever you might favor, you can be sure that the Illinois State Legislature will never in your lifetime pass a limit on term limits. So we are left with the voter alternative. Now, it's very important not to claim too much for term limits. Based on political science studies done to date, term-limited legislatures and city councils do not automatically lower the taxes or pass better budgets. It is not an automatic budget fix for all our problems. Although electing new legislators and new legislative leaders in Illinois will help because they will bring new perspectives and more current perspectives to Springfield. Term limits are, in truth, only one tool of good government, not a guarantee of good government. Campaign finance reform, redistricting reform, ethics reforms, all of these still need to be passed at all levels of government in Illinois. But elected officials still have to be defeated beyond term limits. And good elected officials have to be elected. We have to do it in our voting and in our efforts. So I've said, term limits are not a panacea. They will not change us overnight from being one of the most corrupt to one of the good government states in the nation. But they are an important step. They're an important step in ending our culture of corruption and another nail in the coffin of machine politics. With term limits, we will never again have a Madigan machine ruling Springfield and running the state. Someday we may even end machine politics here in Chicago. And I'll be glad to have your questions and to provide whatever information I can towards this discussion. Yeah, I see Alan's hand. Sharon? Yes, political scientist Sharon Alter.
Thank you. My question has to do with the increased power of lobbyists if we have term limits. In other words, the experience level, the substantive knowledge level of those who are in term-limited legislatures decreases. And with that, those who have institutional history and substantive knowledge are the lobbyists. Wouldn't this phenomenally increase the power of lobbyists?
Well, let me answer another question first and then answer specifically your question. One of the usual charges is, oh my God, we're only going to have a legislator be able to serve 8 years. It'll take them 4 years to learn where the bathroom is and how to get down the corridor. Well, I was an alderman. By the second or third month I was in the city council, I was fighting the mayor over the most fundamental legislation available. By the time we got to the budget in the fall of the year after I was elected and started in April, we offered 100 budget amendments to change the city budget. The idea that people who get elected to the legislature are just doomkoffs who can't figure out what to do or don't know how to draft legislation after they've been there a few months and can't use the Legislative Reference Bureau to help them polish it, I think is false. Now, yes, maybe in general, lobbyists will get more influence, but lobbyists also come in all sorts of stripes. You could have the Paul Simon Institute coming down and say we should have ethics reform for all of these good reasons. And the legislators might not know everything, but they can figure out, is that advice good advice? Will we have weakened legislatures, which was the suggestion before? Well, perhaps, but I don't think that's necessarily true. I was in a city council which is a rubber stamp. The people had been there forever. You were born in Chicago, lived in Chicago, became alderman and died in Chicago, not necessarily in that order. The city council was a rubber stamp even though there were no term limits, and many of my colleagues 65 years of age and older were useless as aldermen, if you mean by alderman someone promoting a legislative agenda. So I think it depends on the quality of people we put in the legislature, much more than it does on the question of they can serve only 8 years.
What is your opinion on that? Is it getting worse or better?
Well, there's no doubt in my mind anyway, and I think in most observers, that when we had the opportunity to bullet vote, and in which you could essentially have proportional representation so that every district had one member of the minority party elected. From Chicago, you can remember the people like Art Telser, people all across the city who were Republicans winning in Democratic districts, who were the moderates who allowed you to pass good legislation. And the same thing happened in the reverse in downstate, where you could elect Democrats to the state legislature from purely Republican districts. I thought that system was better. However, it turns out that's not on the ballot this time, so that's not a choice we have.
What would be a better alternative than term limits?
I don't see them as mutually exclusive. You could have both. Perhaps particularly under this new system, because you'd be creating districts with 3 representatives for each senator under the proposed particular referendum that's on the ballot. But it's a separate issue as to whether we're going to go back to allowing bullet voting.
Hi, Alan Ellis. You mentioned about new well-qualified candidates. My concern is if you have term limits, plus the high cost today of running for office, won't you be discouraging well-qualified candidates from running?
I don't think so. Again, the example in the city council, the people who know they're going to be there for life tend to be the worst members of the city council, in my view, and I've known a lot of them. I've known all 150 that have been there since I was. The longtime career politicians who worked their way up through the political party and now deserve, because it's their turn now, to serve, are not good results. Some of the citizen folks like me, I served 2 terms and then voluntarily stepped down, I think are the better members of the city council.
Professor Simmons, a question about, I think I may have detected a little bit of intellectual conflict in your argument this morning, because I think I just heard you say that the quality of our legislature depends upon the quality of the people we elect to serve there.
Correct.
Which is certainly true. But it seems to me that by advocating for term limits, you're making a somewhat undemocratic argument that if we discover someone serving who is really brilliant and providing outstanding leadership, that we should artificially limit our ability to re-elect him or her for the sake of this institutional constraint. So I don't understand why, on the one hand, you think that people should be trusted to elect the best people to represent them. On the other hand, if they find someone they think is really doing a good job, they should be constrained from re-electing that person to do the job and to continue to represent them.
Well, I'll tell you what, David, I'll make a deal with you. You get rid of machine politics, both Republican and Democratic, in the state of Illinois, and I'll give up advocating term limits.
You pointed out that the problem with term limits is these really long-term people who stay in office. Has there ever been a consideration, I know when we talk about term limits, it seems to have been 6 years, 8 years, 12 years. How about you can't serve more than 20 years? Because that obviously...
Yeah. To answer your question directly, my own sense is that 20 years is too long, or any of the big numbers that you might come up with. And this is the reason. I think when you come to office, you come in with an agenda, and you come in with enthusiasm, and you come in with effort. Now, I've known people to serve 20 years. Linda Prey comes to mind, again, using the city rather than the state example. Linda Prey was a great alderman when he left after 20 years of the city council, and then he came back as parliamentarian under Jane Byrne and Harold Washington for more time to help guide the parliamentary procedure of the city council. So you can always find an exception, and and we could agree on, Paul Simon served a long time, but not in any one position. He moved positions. I just don't think there's that much enthusiasm, new ideas, flexibility. Whereas if they went out of office and then came back and served in some other position, yes, I think they could use the experience they gained in the state legislature to be a good state comptroller or a good treasurer or a good secretary of state, or that they could go back and serve as mayor in their local community, which might be a smaller town. So I'm not saying that people should be barred from life, from intervening again. Often, people get appointed to offices. Marty Oberman was just elected to be the chairperson of Metro. I think that's a great step. He learned a lot in city council, and we're lucky that he'll be able to use that knowledge for us. So I'm not suggesting a ban on public service, but I think being stuck in the same place and becoming ever more powerful has mostly a bad effect in general. There are exceptions, and I'm perfectly willing to admit there are exceptions, and they're some of the greatest people we've had serve in public life in Illinois.
Yeah, I was curious about my name is Mark Keener, and I'm curious about your opinion about how the machine politics work with term limits. What would be the role then of the political organizations as far as finding qualified candidates and rotating them through these positions?
Well, I'm an independent politician, even though I vote Democratic most of the time. I believe that we have to have either a reform sector of the political parties or an independent sector pushing the political parties to bring forth the best candidates. Again, because in Illinois, we are governed, for the most part, by machine political parties. And many of them are still closed-door operations. You can't really be part of the decision about who's going to be selected for office if it's controlled by the ward committeemen in their separate meetings. They're not closed door anymore, they don't smoke cigars anymore, but they still handle clout in the same way. So I think you have to push to reform the political parties, and if the political parties don't reform, you have to form organizations like IVI-IPO and advocate for the best candidates inside each political party. That's just a part of our heritage and history that we need to get over. We need to grow up.
We have time for one last one.
My name is Woodruff Thompson, and my comment and question is this. In the neighboring state of Wisconsin, and I'm not trying to go from the particular to the general, but we have two senators. We have Cole and we have Johnson. And I haven't heard a peep out of Cole and so on that I almost forgot who he is. And Johnson, being fresh, got in there and has made waves, and I'm not suggesting that I agree with everything he's done, but I'm saying that I don't believe that the story that we all learned as school children, that the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker drop their work and go and practice a little politics for a couple of years and then go back home and do what they do. And it seemed to me that that was a pretty good system. Now today, if I wanted to run for the legislature or any other, even dog catching, the perks and the retirement are predicated on serving just once. So no matter how much money I get to run and win, I can bank on the fact that I can pay it back. So it seems to me that it's a circular discussion. I just can't understand why a guy is good because he's been sitting there for 50 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Don't think that requires my comment.
Dick, thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Charlie Leonard. Charlie directs the Simon Institute's poll that we've polled over the years on this question of term limits, and so I've asked Charlie to give us a little briefing on our findings. Charlie?
Thank you, David, and thank you for coming. Thank you for your attention. I'd like to reiterate my colleagues' appreciation to the Union League Club and the BGA and the McCormick Foundation. Social science likes variation. We do polls because we like to see how different groups react to public policy proposals. And I'm sort of here to tell you I'm sorry there's not much variance to study on the topic of public opinion on term limits. Here are the dry details on our poll of 1,001 registered voters across the state of Illinois. That gives us a margin of error of plus or minus 3.5 percentage points. We maintain quota by area code and by gender. And our phoning is done by an independent contractor in the Austin, Texas suburbs. When we have Illinois candidate names, we do send pronunciation guides to the phoners. And to maintain our independence, we use funds from the Institute Endowment, not state funds. No matter how you phrase the question, no matter what group you ask, support of term limits in Illinois has been consistent over time. Here is the ballot question we used. Would you favor or oppose a proposal to limit state representatives and state senators to 8 years of service? And here are the frequencies. Over 6 in 10 Illinois voters strongly favor term limits. Another 18% somewhat favor it. So we're pushing 80% favoring term limits. And we've asked this over time. Where's my laser? The top line, the blue line, is strongly favor term limits, and that's 2010, 2011, 2012, and 2014. We skipped that question in 2013. And the green line is somewhat favor. And you can see the only real movement over time is that the percentage strongly favoring term limits has gone up slightly, and the percentage somewhat favoring it might have gone down a little bit. That's what I mean by a lack of variance to study. I wish I could give you something more interesting than that. I thought about putting up just one slide and saying, do Illinois voters favor it? Yes. Good night. Any questions? But Dave said I had to give the poll junkies a little more to chew on than that. The leadership term limit question has been kicked around here today, and we have been polling on that over time. We have about the same percentage favoring leadership term limits as we do legislative term limits. And we've asked that question 3 times, and as before, about the same percentage favor it as before, and the movement we see is that the strongly favoring term limits has gone up. I should mention that in the 2014 survey, we asked about the 8-year term limit that the term limits group has been proposing. And in the previous years, we asked about a proposal that would limit House terms to 5 and Senate terms to 3. But as I said in the opening slide, no matter how you ask it, the response is about the same. I don't think that the uptick in strong favor has to do with the wording of the question. I think it has to do with the trend in voter sentiment. Sorry, I didn't say that before. Strong support in every subgroup. We expect Chicago suburbs to have high support for term limits. We expect private sector employees to have strong support for term limits. We expect conservatives and Republicans to have strong support for term limits. The groups you might not expect to have strong support for term limits. Large majorities of Democrats favor it. Large majorities of liberals favor it. Large majorities of public sector workers favor term limits. Large 3/4 of Chicago city voters favor term limits. Opposition barely tops 25% among the African Americans in our sample. If you're an opponent of term limits and you're looking for people to rally, and you get only 1 in 5 liberals on your side, well, it's going to be a tough slog. I have a graduate student who's a doctoral student in economics, and I gave him my data, and I said, go find me some correlate of opposition to term limits. And he came back with a fat stack of logistic regression results and said, I got nothing. Chris, if you want to see them, I'll share them with you, a big stack of nothing. Well, why is support this strong, this even over time, over different wordings of the question, over different forms of term limits? I think nothing I have here to show you will be a surprise. We tested a couple of arguments for term limits and a couple of arguments against term limits, and the common refrain that term limits make politicians more responsive to their constituents gets wide support in our sample. Term limits, by definition, bring new people and may or may not bring fresh ideas. 80%, over 80% agree. Not surprisingly, our arguments against term limits did not find strong support. Poll respondents and voters don't like cognitive dissonance. So if I've just told you I strongly support term limits and I give you these arguments against them, you expect them not to have much traction. Term limits don't give elected officials enough time to develop expertise to handle Illinois' complex problems. Not quite 3 in 10 agree with that argument, and a majority disagree. Term limits give more power to lobbyists and unelected staff. Gained a little more traction, a little over a third agreed strongly or somewhat with that argument against term limits. I have spoken to lobbyists and staff in Springfield who are all for term limits. They seem to think that is true. We'll see if Professor Mooney's data bear that out. The frustration with government that shows up in our poll and other people's polls goes a long way to explain why support for term limits, why this strong cudgel against politicians gains such traction. 7 in 10, more than 7 in 10 in our latest poll said Illinois is on the wrong track, off track and moving in the wrong direction. 90% say that corruption is very or somewhat common in Illinois. 6 in 10 say corruption at the state level impacts people's lives. In our 2012 Simon poll, done for a symposium here at the Union League Club, 6 in 10 voters said they believe Illinois is more corrupt than other states. And in the Gallup poll that Professor Simpson referenced, not 3 in 10 trust their state government to do the right thing in Illinois, the lowest in the United States by a lot. This helps explain why a blunt instrument like term limits is so strongly supported by our voters consistently and over time. Would it pass if it made the ballot? Oh, yeah. As I said before, I wish there were more group or regional variants to talk about here today. Are voters for it? Yes. with that, I'd be glad to entertain some questions. And I've got us back some time on our agenda. There's a question there.
Paul Baker. Your basic question is pretty abstract. Another example is if you ask parents in Chicago how the public schools are doing, the majority will say they're not doing very well. But if you ask them how their school is doing, 85%, 90% think it's a fantastic school. So have you asked them what they think of their state legislature? Do they want to replace their state legislator? Because they already have the ability to put term limits on the local legislature.
We did not ask whether they wanted to replace their own legislator. What term limits does is it limits everybody's legislator. In other words, if I like my guy, I can't keep him. But we did not ask that question. There's some more here in the middle.
Hi, I'm Alice. I was wondering what the influence of two words was on your poll. That's Mike Madigan, who's mentioned a number of times. Mike Madigan hasn't been Speaker of the House. Do you think your polling data would be somewhat different, a little different, significantly different, or very different?
Other don't know. We all know who Mike Madigan is. Most of the voters probably don't know who Mike Madigan is. We asked, I can't remember which poll a few years ago, we asked approval ratings of elected officials in the state, and a great big chunk of people, when we asked how is Speaker Madigan doing, didn't know who he was. So it's sort of an inside baseball question. Sure.
My question is, basically, a lot of the people in the community really don't know their state representative because, one, have you asked the question, has he ever been to one of your old block club meetings, with just like community function? They really don't attend, so they really don't know who their senators are, congressmen, but they basically don't even know who the precinct captain is. So here we are today. You're asking questions. Have you asked those questions?
Well, we haven't asked that. I would make a quick observation about regional politics. In Chicago, your alderman's probably more important to you than your state representative. But in small town, southern Illinois, the state representative is a pretty big deal. We don't have precinct captains in Carbondale. Right. But right. That's a state, yeah. This is a statewide poll, and we didn't ask city. Yeah.
A few years ago, there was a poll taken, and I've lived on the north side of Chicago virtually all my life. There was a poll taken about the public's opinion of Congress. And the majority, strong majority, was very negative. But when people were asked, what do you think of your congressman, in our case it was Sidney Yates, overwhelming majority was, we love him. And now my congressperson is Jan Schakowsky. Again, the answer would probably be from a majority of my voters, my neighbors, that they don't like Congress, but they love Jan Schakowsky. And the problem with term limits, in my opinion, is that even though you may love your legislator, term limits takes that away from you. Would you comment?
Well, as I said, it's a blunt instrument, and it limits other people's representative. In other words, if I love my state representative, I think Brandon Phelps is my representative, term limit says I can't keep him. But it limits your representative because your representative is a bum, and my guy is great. And so I think people would be willing to give up the legislator they love so they could limit everybody else's bum.
If everybody loves their legislator, why does everybody hate Congress? I mean, what is the disconnect there? That if your own personal one is great, and you want to limit everybody else, I mean, there definitely seems to be a disconnect here.
Well, I think it's probably familiarity. Schools are terrible, but my kid's teacher is great because I know my kid's teacher and I don't know everybody else's teacher. Test scores are bad, so it must be the other guy's fault. Thank you, folks.
I don't see Bob Costello. Bob, are you here? Okay, good. Our next speaker was supposed to be Dr. Mark Campbell from the Committee for Legislative Reform and Term Limits. He's under the weather this morning. So filling in for him is a member of the board of directors of that group, Bob Costello. Bob?
First of all, thank you for being here today. We'll get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of where the petition is and the initiative. I've been involved in the term limit movement for over 20 years. I was involved with the term limit initiative, 8 is Enough, back in 1994. Worked with Pat Quinn, who did a great job on that initiative back in 1994. It was good to see Paul Vallis here this morning. I generally vote Republican, but I did vote for Paul in that gubernatorial race. Probably about a third of the time I vote in the Democratic primaries when there's nobody good on the Republican side. It's too bad we could have saved some money on federal prisons if we would have elected Paul. I don't think he would have gone that route. I'm curious today of who in this room has read part or a lot of the Federalist Papers. We'll see who all took their political science classes. The issue that I don't think has been brought up enough here is the real issue is that power corrupts. And that's why we put limits on political power, because the longer you serve, the more corrupt politicians become. There are exceptions. It shouldn't be any surprise why the voters, almost 80%, support term limits in this state. 2 out of the last 3 governors have gone to federal prison. We have a pension situation that we're hanging over the abyss on. It's questionable whether those will ever be able to be honored. We've got massive debt in the state. But getting back to the Federalist Papers, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, these were folks that knew that power corrupts. And they talked about checks and balances and limits on political power. In Federalist number 51, Madison said, "What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men are angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external or internal controls on government would be necessary. We know the folks in Springfield are not angels. We also know that government power must be limited or it will become tyrannical." It's interesting. Illinois and Chicago is a very unique place. I moved here in 1980 when I was in my 20s, and love this state, love community of Chicago. I actually live in Evanston, but worked most of my life in Chicago. The 10 largest cities in the United States, out of the 10 largest cities, 9 of them have some type of term limits on their city government. Chicago is the only one of the 10 that does not. I think that's interesting. The other thing that's exciting about this year, I'm going to give you some information about where we're at on our initiative, but there's 2 very good constitutional amendment initiatives this year. The independent maps, which is to try to take away the power of the politicals, whether they be Republicans or Democrats, to gerrymander the districts, I think it's going to make the ballot also this year. And I think it's going to be a really strong 1-2 punch, term limits and the independent maps initiative. Now you look at choices. it's more a case that the legislators choose their districts than the voters choose their legislators. You look at how ugly some of those legislative districts are in terms of how they string them along in a gerrymandering manner. That's why voters are frustrated. I happen to, maybe I'm an exception here. I happen to be one of the people that has never liked my congressperson. I've voted in every congressional race since 1972, and there hadn't been a time a year out you wouldn't have been able to tell me who was going to be the congressperson. So that's, I think, why we're seeing a lot of low voter turnout. They don't feel like, voters don't feel like they can have an impact on who they're voting for, since half the time it's not a competitive district. Not half the time, much more than half the time. So where do we stand on the legislative reform and term limit initiative? We need to collect 298,000 valid signatures. The drop dead date is May 4th. As of April 2nd, we had 409,000 signatures in hand. Now, we do expect a challenge, so we want to make sure that there's no mistake that the voters want this on the ballot. We plan on coming in with more than 500,000 signatures. We're going strong right now. The weather really slowed us down. It was, as everybody knows, it was a tough winter. So we're a little bit over 400,000, but we want to collect another 100,000 on top of that. A lot of the things I plan to say today, a lot of it has been covered. There's been some really good presentations, and it's a great forum here to be at. But there are 24 states, as was said earlier, that have the initiative process, that have the citizen initiative process. One of the things that's interesting is, though, Illinois' initiative process is one of the worst. You can only address issues that directly affect the state legislature. In fact, let me pull out the part of the Constitution here that lays that out, and if I have it handy, maybe not. Amendments shall be limited to the structural and procedural subjects contained in Article 4. Now, Article 4 is the legislative article in the Constitution. So, in the state of Illinois, you can only address legislative issues. So we would love to put term limits on the statewide offices, governor, attorney general, secretary of state, so on, like a lot of states have. More states, more than, I believe it's more than 50% of the states have term limits on their governors. We can't do that through the citizen initiative process in Illinois because we have such a weak process. And the Supreme Court hasn't been very helpful it's been helpful making it even weaker, which I'll talk to you a little bit later. As was said, there's currently 15 states that have term limits. Assuming we get the number of signatures, which we're in good shape on that, I'm sure there'll be a legal challenge. We're putting together a very strong legal team. I suspect we're going to have a former federal appeals court judge as one of our members of our legal team. So it'll be on the ballot in November, and the voting's, you do need 60% of the people voting for the initiative for it to pass are 50% of the people who vote at the election. There'll be a lot of people that will start on the top of the ballot, are excited about the governor's race, that might not make it all the way to the bottom of the ballot. So we either have to have 50% of all the people who vote in the whole election or 60% of the people who vote on our initiative. Not sure where I left off here. But again, talking about when people want to put limits on the committee chairs and other ideas to try to improve government, we can't, like California or other places, we can't do that through the initiative process because it only allows us to address certain things in the legislature. Going back to 1994, we collected, for 8 is enough, we collected over 430,000 signatures to put term limit amendment on the ballot. It was thrown off at a 4-3 decision by the court. It was very interesting that the fact there was 3 members of the court that thought it was constitutional, and they had their rationale ready why they thought it was constitutional. The 4 members who said it was unconstitutional, they were up against a ballot printing deadline. They said it's unconstitutional, and we'll be back to you shortly with our rationale. And it was about 10 days or 2 weeks later that they came back and said that we didn't address both the procedural and the structural, that it was just a straight term limit initiative. This year, there's 3 components to our initiative. One is 8 years max on the legislature, serving the legislature. You can do 2 in the House, you can do 6 in the Senate, but a combination between the 2 houses of 8 years. So that would put us in the lifetime ban category that we saw earlier from the Denver study. The second component is that we reduced the Senate from 59 seats to 41 seats. We increased the House from 118 seats to 123 seats. So instead of having 2 House seats in each Senate district, this would go back to 3 House in each Senate district. I think it helps with people with name recognition, gives them a chance to have more competitive races in the Senate side. You've got 3 people that have a natural base within the Senate seat. The third component is it makes it harder to override the governor's veto. It goes from 3/5 to 2/3, so basically going from a 60% vote in both houses to override the governor's veto to a 67% vote in both houses, which is actually more consistent with other state legislatures out there. A little bit of talk, whenever I talk to people about term limits, they always say, hey, this is important, we need to do this. Again, it doesn't take care of everything, but it's another tool in democracy to limit corruption. But everybody's response is, we need this on the federal Congress too. I was involved in that. I'm on the board of U.S. term limits. At one point, we had 46% of the federal delegations were under term limits, and it was all done in states with the initiative process. That was the only place where we had made any gains. The legislators weren't going to do it on their own. But actually, in early '95, the term limit movement was so popular, there were 2 non-initiative states, Texas and New Hampshire, that had the votes and looked like they were going to pass that year to put term limits on their own delegation going outside the initiative process. What happened, which was mentioned earlier, was there was a Supreme Court case, U.S. term limits, I believe it was an Arkansas case. In a 5-4 decision, they ruled that states couldn't put limits on their state delegation. Stevens wrote the majority opinion. I thought Thomas's opinion was better, relied upon the 10th Amendment in terms of powers left unspoken were left to the states and the people. So that completely stopped the term limit movement unless we have a constitutional amendment. Now, we've had 27 constitutional amendments. All of them have originated in Congress. The Republicans, just as corrupt as equal opportunity corrupters, they, in their contract with America in '94, they had term limits as a plank, but they let their members vote on 5 different term limit proposals, so everybody could say they supported term limits, but none of them came anywhere close to getting the votes they needed to make it there. Now, there is one development. There's some people out there pushing for a constitutional convention. This is the other way to make a constitutional amendment, to have the states call for a constitutional convention. I believe one state so far has put out a call for it, and there's other states considering it. I'm not completely up to date on that, but that is in the process right now. And this might be a case when we need to go around Congress, because Congress isn't likely to do it on themselves. So again, the founders believed in a rotation in office. When Benjamin Franklin wrote the first Constitution for the Commonwealth in Pennsylvania, it required a rotation in office. Support for term limits is founded on a conviction that self-government is preferred to government by experts. Self-government means that it is men and women like us who are part of the broader private lives and of limited time carry our voices to the Council of Government. It is essential to make laws in a citizen legislature. They know that they will soon return to live underneath those same laws. I think one of the biggest points that people miss with term limits is that we currently have a negative pre-selection process. There's a lot of very successful people out there that would like to contribute to their community, to their state, to their municipality, but they don't want to become a career politician. They'd be willing to spend 2 years, 4 years, or 6 years. And they look at the process we have right now, and it's like you're not gonna be a powerful person in the legislature unless you're there, what is it, at least 6 or 8 years or 10 years. If you look at the first 100 years of our republic, the average term served in Congress they served less than 2 terms in Congress. Henry Clay was elected Speaker of the House when he first ran, his first year in Congress. I think one of the things that probably saved the republic from the growth of government was the fact we didn't have air conditioning until earlier in the 20th century. People didn't really want to go to Washington and spend a lot of time there. Maybe we could bring that back and not have air conditioning in Springfield and government legislative bodies. So those are some of my basic notes on this, but I think that the pre-selection process, we could have a lot more people consider running for office that would be very good contributors to the legislature. And I'd like to open up to questions.
Question about the other provisions aside from the term limits and the amendment.
Can you speak up?
There's 3 provisions in the amendment.
Correct.
Okay, and the first one is term limits. The second one is a change in the number of the state legislators.
Right.
And I want you to explain that a little bit more. Was that done just to give us a few more state representatives, or was it done to meet the constitutionality of Article 4 that says the amendment has to be structural and procedural?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. There will be some cost savings involved because we're dropping more Senate seats than we are picking up in House seats. We did want to go back to having 3 seats in each Senate district. We think that is going to be good to help encourage competitive races. It definitely hurts. It definitely helps legal arguments in terms of structural and procedural questions. We'd given a lot of thought to this when we put this together last summer, and so I think the key ones are we wanted to go to 3 House for each Senate. We wanted to have some cost savings involved, and we wanted to make our legal arguments strong. Because Illinois, if you haven't noticed, it's a pretty political state, and they'll try to use any grounds they can to throw us off the ballot.
Sharon Alter, my question is a 2-part question. One, what do you think or believe will be the legal argument to not have this on the ballot? And what will be your legal argument to have it on the ballot?
Their argument will be Mike Madigan said we want this off the ballot. Well, you asked me a question. I told you what I think their argument is. My argument is that we do have an initiative process. The cutback amendment in 1980 has been held constitutional. This includes provisions that are similar to the cutback amendment. And I think when we tried to put this on the ballot in 1990, term limits was popular, but it was nowhere near as popular as it is now. And the corruption level has gotten just to the intolerable level. When you have 2 out of your last 3 governors go to federal prison, when you have somebody who runs the state of Illinois like it's his own personal fiefdom, where he's making calls to people, to local village presidents and saying, hey, I hear you're hiring a part-time guy for a building inspector. You know, I think you should look at this guy. The corruption level is over the top. It needs to end. That's what our argument is about.
Hi, Alan Wells. I just want clarification. If I understand my friend Professor Simpson, he liked when Roy Sank was my Republican representative in the Democratic Chicago precinct or area. It sounds like from what Dick said that that's not the way this is set up.
No, the old Constitution, you had to have somebody from the one party out of the three had to be from the opposite party.
Is that what your initiative is? That if it's not, why not?
Well, ours is there'll be individual districts inside each Senate district for the House, and we just decided not. You know, I think there's merits to that. I think there's arguments back and forth. We've passed that point last summer when we looked at that, and we decided not to go that way.
It seems like we had a good system before. If you're going to go to 3-1 with a minority, so I'm really sad that you haven't picked that. Thank you.
Okay.
Cynthia Schultz. I heard this rumor, and I don't know whether this is true. I've been collecting signatures for the redistricting, and we're hoping to get that on the November ballot.
Right.
That's what we were hoping to get on the November
Right.
ballot. I had heard that there was a limit on the number of constitutional amendments that could be on the ballot, and that there was also, Mike Madigan was also going to be introduced, the legislature was going to be introducing another thing that was going to be on the ballot. In other words, they couldn't all appear on the ballot. And I'm wanting to know,
Sure.
Is any of this true?
Good, very good question. I'm not an expert on this, but that both these initiatives, if they get the signatures and they pass any legal muster, will be on the ballot. They cannot be prohibited. I think, and I'm not an expert on this, I think there's a limit to how many things the state legislature can put on, because they can put issues on the ballot by a vote of the state legislature. But when you use the citizen initiative, which is a really hard process, it's been done very infrequently, the legislature can't preempt this. Great question.
Hi, Carol Monner. What came first, the term limit initiative or Bruce Runner?
Good question.
And the follow-up is, are the success of each of them tied? Yeah.
Well, let me answer the second one first. No, they're not tied together at all. So I've been on the U.S. Term Limit Board off and on for a number of years. I served on it in the 90s. I came back on a few years ago. Howard Rich, who's kind of the leader of national term limit effort, he was very involved back in the 90s in a number of the states. He's from the East Coast. He was involved with Pat. Back in 94, we had two co-chairs for the term limit initiative. Pat Quinn was the Democratic co-chair. Al Labate was the Republican co-chair. He used to be county executor in DuPage County. So this time around, we've been looking for a way to get this issue done again. It's an expensive process, and Howard Rich came across Bruce Ronard in the last probably about almost 2 years ago, and found out that he was very pro-term limits and that he wanted to help get this done. And the two of them really committed to the seed money to get off the ground and to raise money for it. But completely separate. I'm very pleased that we have two candidates for governor, I think, that both support term limits. Pat hasn't talked about it much. I've supported Pat in the past when he ran for lieutenant governor. I have not heard Pat talk about it much in the past, but it's great to have two candidates that both support it.
Are these all separate initiatives that will be on the ballot, or are they combined into one? And two, where are the petitions?
Great question. Completely separate initiatives. The independent maps, I've heard their presentation a couple of times. I've signed their petition. I support them. I think it's a great initiative. I don't have any of their petitions. I have our petitions, Anybody, and I've got, our website is reformandtermlimit.org. You can get information there, but before you leave, please sign a petition I have or take a petition I have. We want to kind of wrap this up within the next 2 or 3 weeks. We want to have pretty much everything in hand by the 21st of April, because one of the requirements is that there's so much language on the petition. Here's what the petition looks like. There's so much language on the petition. It has to be on legal size. The requirement by the state is all of our petitions have to be bound together and delivered to the Secretary of State's office. That's going to require us to take it down in a semi-truck, because it's going to have to, and it's probably going to snake out and snake back up, and it all has to be bounded in one book, which is the legal requirement. The one nice change that was made, that's made it, when we did this in '94, everybody in the state can sign the same petition, the same piece, because now you just put what county you're at. When we did this in '94, we had to have a separate petition for Cook County, a separate one for DuPage County, wherever you lived, we had to have a separate petition. Now we can put everybody on one petition, which makes our life a lot easier.
Could this have been included with materials that were present at the time of the primaries, so that people could have gotten copies? Was there any legal restriction?
I don't think there's any. There would have been all kinds of objections to that. We tried to get a lot of people out on the real heavy polling places, but turnout was pretty low. There weren't a lot of great polling places.
Bob, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bob, thank you for being here and for filling in for Dr. Campbell. Our next speaker is no stranger to Illinois government and politics. Dr. Chris Mooney is the director of the Institute of Government and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois. We're very pleased. Chris is, as I mentioned with Carl Kurtz, one of the nation's leading experts on the question of term limits around the country, and Chris, of course, has special expertise here in Illinois. So, Dr. Mooney.
Okay, thanks very much. But I will say that, well, first of all, let me just say, IGPA, and the Institute of Government and Public Affairs at the U of I, we are the, am I not on? Oh, okay, here, let me do this. Well, it's not gonna come off. Okay, we're the public policy think tank at the U of I that focuses on state of Illinois issues. We're not an advocacy group. I'm maybe one of the few up here that doesn't I'll try not to have a point of view on this. And I tell my people all the time, we're not an advocacy group, except that we advocate for better information in the public policy discussion in this state. That is our constituency. And we bring to bear what economists and sociologists and political scientists know about these issues from the state of or from the University of Illinois on issues impacting the state. And obviously this is an important one, and I appreciate the Union League Club and the Simon Center and the Better Government Association for offering what I think is really an important opportunity to air some of these issues, especially early on in this campaign, that is, if it gets on the ballot. Okay, right. Term limits, as we know, is prescribing a certain number of years or terms for a holder of a given office. And in executive offices in the United States, this is quite common, quite non-controversial. Starts with George Washington, serves a couple of terms. You know, the Cincinnatus model, go back to the plow, or in his case, the distillery. And, you know, it becomes a tradition in this country for over 100 years until FDR rudely violated it during the war, and then it was codified in the 22nd Amendment in 1951. Today, 37 governors in this state are term limited. Most of them are in the presidential model, 2 4-year terms, not all. In Virginia, you only get 1 term. In Utah, you can have 3. But as most of you probably know, Illinois is not one of these 37 states. But legislative term limits is another matter entirely. Long-serving legislators in Congress, in the states, are a tradition in this country and are embedded in how the legislatures in the U.S. are organized. So things like the norm of seniority privilege, apprenticeship, the learning process, leadership power structure, and these sorts of things are all based on the routine of returning lawmakers term after term, so as they move up the ladder. That's just, sort of non-normative. That's just how it's done. That's how legislatures in the United States tend to work, and as compared to legislatures of other models in other countries. And as Bob, the last speaker, mentioned, this is taken for granted, but it's not necessary, because Henry Clay was indeed elected Speaker of the House on the first day that he served in that chamber. So, even though it's not mandatory, it's certainly the norm, and term limits then on legislative office holders is a major departure from traditional American approach to how we do legislatures. Okay, so why should we care? We're in Illinois. Obviously, a year ago this was an academic exercise, and there would have been 3 people in the room. But now, with the major push to get this on the ballot, people in Illinois care, or should care, about this issue. Back last summer, Bruce Rauner and friends founded the committee for legislative reform and term limits, and we have a little show their website here. It's very nice. It's got, we're going to stop those career politicians. You scroll down a little bit, and you can see what they're getting at here. So here's the bad guy. This silver-headed guy, he's the bad guy. And here's the good guy. This Graham next door. She's going door to door, talking some common sense to the voters of Illinois, and that's great. The last time I looked, they raised about $750,000. I'm sure it's greater than that now for this political action committee, and it's been raised through a few large donations from some really rich people, I suppose, given how much money they gave. For example, Sam Zell gives $100,000 last August. Howard Rich, who was mentioned, he's a guy from New York who is a big backer of U.S. term limits, is an interest group, an advocacy group for term limits, and they were the ones that ran the table in the 90s in the other states. They gave $100,000 in August. Jennifer Just, who runs a investment firm here in town, that's all I know about her. She gave $100,000 in February. U.S. term limits itself gives $40,000 last month, and then Rauner gives $250,000 last December. There's another $20,000 that gives sort of $100,000 or $1,000 to $25,000 that have been currently reported. But basically, we're talking about 4 or 5 people, entities that have bankrolled this thing. Rauner himself's given like 3/4 of this money. Because of that, some have argued, and it's been discussed, that this may be a ploy really to augment Rauner's gubernatorial bid. Maybe. I don't really know. But if it is, it's a darn smart one, because it really helped him differentiate himself from the other candidates that he was running against, especially in the Republican primary. He says, I'm for term limits. 80% of the people in Illinois love term limits. The other 20% aren't paying attention, or they've read the question wrong, or whatever it is. Everybody loves term limits. And who is he standing on the stage with? 3 long-serving state senators and a treasurer who used to be you get the picture. It's great for him. He's a man of the people, and he's got that watch, so it's all good for him. So whether or not he deeply believes in this or it's just a ploy, we don't know. It doesn't really matter, because the genie's out of the bottle right now, so let's talk about exactly what this proposal is. Article 14, Section 3 of the Illinois Constitution is that section which talks about the initiative and what it takes to do initiative. It's a very narrow provision for an initiative in this state. Well, as was mentioned last time, and before we even talk about term limits, we have to talk about what this is all about. It's only on the legislative article, and this, of course, is the idea from the Constitutional Convention is that the legislature there may be things that are good for the state that the legislature doesn't want to do because it's antithetical to its own interest, so you ought to let the citizens do it, and term limits is probably, point one on that agenda. They need to get, in order to get on the ballot, you need 8% of the votes cast, signatures amounting to 8% of the votes cast in the previous gubernatorial election, which, as was mentioned, is almost 300,000. They need to be collected within 2 years and 6 months of a general election. This process started last summer, so the 24 months doesn't matter. But the reason May 4th is drop dead dates because that's 6 months before the general election. You've got to get 3/5 of those voting on the amendment to agree or they vote yes on this thing to get it to pass, or a majority voting in the whole election. Again, as was mentioned, some of this stuff's going to be redundant from previous speakers, but as a college professor, I know that you say things 3 or 4 times, and sometimes people remember it. And then there's this the structural and procedural subjects provision, which is a crucial thing. Amendments are limited to structural and procedural subjects having to do with the legislature, and the Supreme Court has interpreted this to mean the and is actually and. It can't be either or. It's got to be both structural and procedural subjects in an initiative to get onto the ballot. So this is a pretty high bar. It's the highest bar of any initiative process in the country, and that's why we've only had one in the lifetime of this Constitution since 1970. What really matters on this are 2 things. Number one is money. Okay, you've got to have that money for the signature campaign, which, all over the country, as Carl can attest, living in Colorado, and anybody that's been to California lately, you go down to Santa Monica and you can't walk down the Strand without 16 people trying to get you to sign a petition. Those are all paid, and so you need, in this modern day and age, it's not grandma going next door and talking to the neighbor. These are hired people. Also, you got to pay your legal team, and you're going to need it to get around this last one in particular. But in this case, I don't think that's going to be a problem, right? They've got, there's 4 or 5 of them got together and raised $750,000. They could have a poker game and skim off 10% out of the pot, and they could fund the rest of it or something like that. So there's no problem with the money. But the big problem is the Supreme Court, as been alluded to a couple of times. The Supreme Court has to agree that the Article 14, Section 3 is met by the proposed initiative, that it does indeed deal with structural and procedural subjects, and that's really the crucial point. That's an open question, okay? You never know what the Supreme Court's going to do. They can do whatever they want, and their word is law, literally. And I think we'll have a little talk a little bit later about some of the finer legal points here, but it's possible. This could get on, and as well as the remap one, I don't know. But again, make no mistake, if it gets on, it's going to pass. So the real question in this whole process is, what is the Supreme Court going to do? Okay, now the other component of this whole situation in Illinois, besides the initiative aspect of it, is the content of the proposal itself. And there's 3 aspects to the term limits aspects to this proposal. The first one has been mentioned: no person may serve more than 8 years in the General Assembly. Lifetime ban, 8 years. You can do a term, come back in 20 years, do another couple of terms, doesn't matter. It will be the strictest in the nation in a sense. I mean, you saw the Nebraska one is also an 8-year lifetime term, but it's Nebraska. It also is a unicameral legislature, so it's a little different, but it's very strict. The next most strict tend to be, California's got that new 12-year maximum, but Arkansas and Michigan had the 6 in the House and 8 in the Senate that Carl was talking about. So this is going to be a strict one, no doubt about it. Second provision: no person may be elected or appointed senator or representative if upon completion of that term of office that person will have been a member of the General Assembly for more than 8 years. Okay, what's this all about? What this means is that the hoary tradition in the state of appointing people to positions will probably come to an end, I would suspect, or at least largely come to an end. I mean, it's it's traditional, especially some members stepping down, somebody gets elected to the seat, and they and they resign a day, a week, a month, or 2 months or something before the actual inauguration date, so that the new person can get appointed, and then they can get a little leg up on the seniority ladder, such as that matters. That'll be gone because under this provision, a day will be as good as a term. You get appointed 1 day early, you're down to 2 more terms, or 3 more terms. That's all you're going to get. So I don't think people are going to give that up, just for a little edge on seniority. The third provision having to do with term limits here is that time served in the General Assembly before the session beginning next January will not count toward the 8-year service limitation. This is a transitional provision. Basically what they're doing here is grandfathering everybody in. Everybody who's in there now, your time starts at 0. It will start at 0 in January. And this is probably good, because if this wouldn't happen, all hell is going to break loose. Because, 3/4 or something of the General Assembly would suddenly have gotten reelected in November, and then they're out before the time to get inaugurated in January, and so we have uncounted numbers of special elections. It would just be a huge mess. So this was probably a good idea. Some states did it. Most states, when they adopt term limits, they did grandfather everybody, and not every state, but most. But one thing it also means is that a potential Governor Rauner will never have to deal with a term-limited legislature, for good or ill, because unless he's elected for more than 2 terms, which he vows not to do. But many people get into office vowing to be term limited, and their wisdom increases as they stay in office. Okay, so these are the term limits provisions of this particular initiative. There's also these other 2 that have been alluded to, the sort of non-term limit stuff here. 41 senators, 123 representatives, so now we have 59 senators, so that's going to go down. So Senate districts are going to get larger by 50% or something. House districts, now we've got 118, so they're going to be slightly smaller, nested 3 to 1. And the other provision is the 2/3 vote for overriding a veto. Why are these provisions in there? Okay, there was some discussion about that a minute ago. It could be just to deal with this structural and procedural requirements. Okay, that's possible, as was mentioned by one of the questioners. May not be needed. Who knows? Again, the Supreme Court can do whatever they want, and it may be that the term limits by itself would be fine, but maybe the committee is being better safe than sorry, which, after going through all the trouble and expense of getting 500,000 signatures, I don't blame them. I think that's a good idea. The number of seats provision, I don't know what that's going to do, how, it's rather arbitrary in itself. It's, the veto, we do know what the veto provision will do. It will make the governor stronger in this state. It's hard enough to override a veto right now with 3/5. With 2/3, it'll be even harder. So this will increase the strength of the governor if this passes. Just this provision, the veto provision. Okay, so let's imagine at this point, what happens if this proposal becomes law in the state? What's going to happen? And this is purely speculative on my part, but based on what we know about the Illinois General Assembly and based on what we know about the impacts of term limits elsewhere, I think we can make some educated guesses. And I think anytime you're considering a public policy change, this is exactly what you need to do. You need to think, okay, if this happens, what are we going to do? Or what's going to happen? So let's break it down by the good, the bad, and the ugly. This is normative, and I said I wasn't going to be advocating anything here, and I'm not. But we want to think about it in terms of what the pro-term limits people have to say, what the anti-term limits people have to say, and we can kind of assess their expectations. What have we been promised, pro and cons, by these advocates? What do we know about these impacts in other states? and what we know is how it relates to the Illinois General Assembly. The problem with this initiative, or with this proposal in the 90s, when this thing got rushed through, was that we had absolutely no information about what these things were going to do. No, it was de novo. There was some of these term limits in South America, but nobody seemed to think that was quite relevant. So they just made a bunch of claims and ran with it. Everybody loves term limits. It passed. But today, we do know something about what happens with term limits, and we knew a lot more than we did in the 1990s. Thank you very much, Sergio Mendez. And so let's take a look at that. Right, okay, the good. What's the good? What do reformers think would be the result of this term limits? Why do they want it? Why do they think it's a good thing? Well, number one on this hit parade, get rid of Mike Madigan, right? He's the boogeyman of, the GOP, of editorial writers around the state for many years now. And this proposal will indeed get rid of Mike Madigan in 2023, when he's 81 years old, because he will be grandfathered in along with all the rest of them. But also notice that Illinois is not unusual to have this sort of poster child for term limits driving it. Ohio, Maine, California, you may have heard of Willie Brown. These were guys that really were the bugaboo of good government people, especially of the opposite party, and they were not all, both parties are represented there. Long-serving leaders that were sort of what people thought was wrong with that state's government, and they pushed it through on that sound. So Mike Madigan is not the only one of his kind. More generically, the reformers advocated that we're going to stop the rise of these strong legislative leaders in the future, and this is true. The Speaker and the President will have at most 6 years of experience when they ascend the Diaz. This means that they're going to have less chance to accumulate power, as has been mentioned. They're going to have less chance to grant favors and whatnot. I mean, leaders consolidate power as time goes on, and so they won't have as much time, so they won't be as powerful. They will also be lame ducks virtually immediately upon becoming leaders, so they will be weaker. Greater turnover, Carl had that nice chart. Yes, indeed, we're going to have more turnover in the state legislature. We can expect that a little over 25% of the House will be freshmen every term. That's not that different than it is today, especially in the last few years. We have a lot of turnover there. But most strikingly, a little over 50% of the Senate will be freshmen at any given moment, and that will be a big difference. Another thing that the advocates of term limits said we were going to get was a citizen legislature, right? The shopkeeper taking off the apron. By God, I'm going to go down to Springfield and bring some common sense into government. That turned out not to be the case. Again, as Carl alluded to, term limit lawmakers who are elected under term limits are no different than those elected in the non-term limit situation. They're no different, I should say, in terms of demographics. They're no different in terms of political ambition. They're no different in terms of political experience. They're no different in where they go, what other offices they go to afterwards. They're no different in the kind of employment profile. We have more or less lawyers, more or less farmers, none of that stuff. So they're basically the same. There's some slight differences in terms of how peripatetic they are, but that's just by nature of they have to get out when time comes. Okay, so the advocates, they make some arguments, and most of them, this is what's going to happen. I mean, they're right. I mean, we're not going to get that citizen legislature, but that's just not going to happen in a state like Illinois. Big state, urban state, lots of problems, big government. I mean, we're not Arkansas, we're not Montana, right? They can't get the job done in a 4-week legislative session, or at least, well, they could try, I guess, but it probably wouldn't happen. All right, so the bad. What did opponents fear from, or what do opponents fear from term limits? Well, the basic point is, as Carl Kurtz mentioned, they worry that the legislature will be weakened. And why is that bad? Well, it would create an imbalance of power in state government. I mean, one of the geniuses, as we know, and again, the Federalist Papers were mentioned. Well, in the Federalist Papers, they discuss that one of the geniuses of the American system is the balance of power between the three branches. Okay, and so opponents of term limits say, look, if you make the term limits make the legislature weaker, then suddenly we're going to have an imbalance, and we could have tyranny, right? We could have, Rod Blagojevich run amok or whatever. So that's their fundamental concern. There's also concern, sort of philosophical concern about not being able to select somebody that you want to vote for. But institutionally, they're concerned about the legislature getting weak. And the evidence shows that that's pretty much true. Term limit strips a legislature of experience and policy knowledge. They know less. Not that they know nothing, but they know less, not only about the policy areas and the ins and outs and intricacies of public policy, but also about the process of the legislature. So it's complicated, and they can't get things done, so it's chaotic, as was mentioned. Also weakening the legislature is the organizational structures of the body are weakened. And basically the two main organizational structures that allow legislatures to function as they do, again for good or ill, are party leadership and committees. And for party leaders, as I mentioned, they're weaker for the various reasons that I said. I mean, think about it. And this actually happens in I was talking to somebody that's working in around the Ohio legislature, and he said they have a 8-year term limits in the House in Ohio. And he said when the new election comes and they get the open seats, and so these brand new freshmen are coming in there, they start jockeying for who's going to be the speaker out of that group 6 years hence, before they even get inaugurated. Sometimes even before the election, because if it's most seats they know, or who's going to win. And so they don't even know who these people are, but they're running for Senate, well, in this case, Speaker of the House, 6 years hence. And so they set up these leadership paths. So they really don't know who these people are, but they do know how well they can raise money. So raising money becomes a very important criterion for selecting your leaders. And of course, we know that that's all, even without term limits, that's an important criterion, but it tends to be the only one in a couple of these places. And the basic idea is that you just don't know. They don't know much about the process or the policy, and you still have to make these selections early on. Also, community chairs are the same situation. They have to run their committees. They don't know the procedures, and they're not familiar with the policy areas as much as they would be if they had a lot of experience. And so you get these more partisan hearings, and this reduces the influence of the committee system on the floor. And the committee system, again, like the legislative leadership, are important in directing this gigantic amorphous body that is a state legislative chamber in order for them to compete with the other two branches of government, or at least hold their own. So anyway, there's no doubt that the legislature will be weaker. Also, another thing that anti-term limits people will argue is that it's going to shift power, and we've seen a little talk of this again. Term limits will shift power to legislative staff, lobbyists, and the executive branch. Now, again, just like with the pro-term limits people, they weren't exactly right on one of these. It turns out that power really does not shift to the staff, does not shift to the lobbyists, at least in our research. The term limits tends to demoralize staff. You get more turnover with staff, less influence for the most part. Lobbyists hate term limits more than anybody else. And I forget who was talking to some lobbyists down in Springfield, but lobbyists I talk to all around the country, they can't stand term limits. Why? Because their business relies on developing relationships with lawmakers and educating them, on the issues and with their perspective, of course. When you've got turnover like this, 50% turnover in the Senate every election, or 25% turnover in the House every election, and you know that one of those freshmen coming in is going to be the Speaker of the House in 6 years, and you don't know who it's going to be, you've got to get close and personal with all these all these freshmen, right? And so it makes their job really hard. I had one lobbyist tell me that term limits is the lobbyist full employment act, right? Because they got to hire all sorts of lobbyists, which is good for my students. A lot of them are lobbyists, so they'll get more jobs, which I'm all in favor of. So it doesn't help the lobbyists for the most part. It doesn't help the staff, but it does help the executive branch, particularly the governor. Legislatures that are term limited defer to the governor much more than they do before term limits. They don't have that independent power base, and that's probably the single most powerful finding of all the study that we did, and other studies that I've read that other people have done, that over and over again the governorship rises in its influence in the state when you get term limits in. Okay, so again, just the facts. No judgment at this point. Okay, now the ugly part here is, regardless of the previous experience of 15 other states over the last 20 years with term limits, regardless of having 8 years to prepare for term limits coming down the track, if this passes, they're going to see it like a big freight train coming down straight at them for 8 years. It is quite likely that the transition to term limits in 2013 is going to be a major mess in the General Assembly, as all of the actors involved try to get adjusted to it. So they're not, I mean, if past time is any experience, and maybe I'm underestimating the planning, the foresight, the care with which government will be looked after, but other states, we've not seen this. It just goes nuts when term limits hit. And this is particularly the case term limits are the strongest in states that, number one, have professionalized legislatures with, with people that are, meeting a long time, they get a living wage, they've got a fair amount of staff, and which means big states, urban states for the most part, like Illinois, and where term limits are most severe. And Illinois has got both of these in spades. We're one of the most professionalized legislatures in the country, and we're going to have perhaps the most severe term limits in the country. So it's going to hit us like a ton of bricks. And the closest parallels really are California and Michigan, which had this sort of 6 in the House and 8 in the Senate term limit when they first started off. California has since changed, but and it took these states years to figure this out. And even if you could, arguably have they done so yet, I don't know. But I mean, it's a lot less chaotic now than it was when these things first hit. There was constant leadership fights, constant internal squabbling, lack of comity, comity with a T, lots of comedy with a D, and policy gridlock. It was quite messy. Politics and governments will be unstable in Illinois. It will be messy. But again, some people may argue that we've got too much stability in the state, so this may be a good thing. But that's what it's going to look like. It's not going to be pretty, even with all this time in advance. Okay, so let me just conclude by saying, term limits of state legislative term limits is going to be a radical change for politics and government in Illinois. There's no doubt about that. I think both sides of this debate will agree to that. And again, some people are going to say that's a very good thing, right? And I can't argue against that, given the current state of affairs in Illinois politics and Illinois fiscal management, et cetera. But what I hope, again, as a person coming from the Institute of Government and Public Affairs perspective, is that we might have a discussion of this issue in this campaign based more on the existing empirical evidence about what we know about the potential impacts of term limits, rather than sort of a motion in a wing and a prayer, which is how these things mostly, mostly play out. They may be asking too much. I don't know, but I would like to see something like that, and that's why we get involved in this, because we want to inform the discussion as much as we can. But regardless of what we know about term limits in other states, regardless of even if you think it's a terrible thing, and if all these effects that I've just mentioned, you think those are bad, hold on to your hats, as Ben mentioned. If it gets on the ballot, if the Supreme Court allows this initiative on the ballot, it's going to pass. And if it passes, there's going to be a huge change in the legislative process and governing in Illinois, for good or ill. So get ready. And with that, I'll take any questions. Yes? Oh, you got one over here? Who's got the mic? Yes, sir.
I'm just sort of curious, if term limits pass, how will that impact the influence of campaign contributions? We have the Supreme Court sort of opening up the pocket, any kind of limits basically. And it seems to me that it's going to really make a difference that campaign contributions, major campaign contributors will have much more influence with term limits. Like your opinion.
Why would that be? What's the argument on that?
I just like your opinion, I don't know.
Oh, well, one of the things that, another thing that term limits reformers early on talked about was that you're going to get more competition and you're going to get less campaign spending. And there was actually one study that came out in the 90s. Actually, it was before any of them were implemented, so it was weird. But people were so desperate to know what might happen that these economists jumped the gun on it. And they said, oh, look, they looked at California and said, look, campaign finance is going down over a 2-year period. After that, much more research has been done, and turned out that was just an anomaly. It was just a little blip for other reasons, and there's no change in the campaign spending. Doesn't go down, it doesn't go up, doesn't impact it. Just the influence. Well, who am I to say? I mean, the influence of anything. I mean, that's tough. How do you know? I mean, I give $100,000 to Bruce Rauner, and does that mean he's going to do what I tell him to do? Well, him for sure not, right? He'll wonder why I didn't come up with more. But even Quinn, where he doesn't have these big $100,000 donors, at least individuals. Would he answer my phone call? Would he? Probably more likely to, but would it be more likely, let's say in the legislature, why would somebody be more likely to answer my phone call under term limits than not under term limits?
Other questions?
Yeah, Bob, why don't you check this guy out over here?
Actually, I just, Bob was hoping, I just had a question to clarification. You called the term limit, the legislative reform, the Committee for Legislative Reform term limits a PAC. Technically, it's not a PAC, it's a ballot committee. And any money brought into the ballot committee can only be spent to further the ballot initiative.
But it is a political action committee under the
Illinois. In Illinois, it's not a political action committee, it's a ballot committee. It's a different law.
Thank you.
We have a couple over here. She has one.
Thank you so much for your remarks. I'm Christine Walker. If the goal of term limits is to prevent an entrenched legislature, what impact, if any, would there be if we were to restructure the primary election system to, say, the model that Nebraska uses, where you have everyone run, it's a nonpartisan, and the top 2 finishers meet each other in general? Would that create ultimately different policy that would be less threatening than a term limitation?
Okay, now you're bringing the Nebraska case into it, right? But California does it too now that way, and Washington, I think. So that will be particularly useful in places where you've got basically one party, where one party is predominant among voters of a particular jurisdiction. So in Chicago, for Democrats, it used to be DuPage would be for Republicans, not so much anymore, but there's certainly some places, say Effingham or something, for Republicans. What that would allow, I don't know if that's what it would do is it increase competition in the general election. And it might, because basically you're going to get 2 people that have significant support by definition, otherwise they wouldn't have been the top 2 finishers. They're going to be running again head-to-head in the general, whereas now, for example, in Chicago, as we know, even if you get a lot of, you get, for example, down my way, Christian Mitchell gets a tough battle with Jay Travis, I think, and the teachers unions, and beats her, But now he's not going to have any competition in the general election because there's not too many Republicans living around in that district. That would probably increase competition. But the states that do use that are pretty just recently started to. I think this isn't my area of specialty, but I do know that from a logical perspective, you're going to get more competition. Yeah.
Janice Miller, my question has to do with the potential impact on pension system in Illinois. One assumes that there will be a greater turnover in terms of legislatures, getting pensions. What impact would they have on the pension system? If anybody's looked at that?
I don't think anybody's looked at. There's been some studies on sort of fiscal management and do term limits, are they more fiscally responsible? And it turns out there's not much of a difference. It doesn't really matter. Now, one thing about pensions that might, a small aspect of pensions that might matter is that the legislative pension unit. Oh, okay. Well, how long does it take? 8 years to vest? 4? They're vested in 4. Okay, so they'd be vested. But you also, it would be, you gain more as you're in there longer. So, might not be. It might be less, or it might allow an opportunity to get rid of that. Some places have gotten rid of legislative pensions altogether because, it's another way of reducing the incentive to stay a long time.
This will be the last question.
I want to ask a question about pensions as well.
Okay.
The pensions for the outgoing, if this becomes law, the outgoing congressmen and senators, would this impact an already burdened budget?
Via the pensions?
If this becomes law, would this impact from all of these outgoing senators, congressmen, would this impact an already burdened budget? Because we always talk about the state budget and what's the prices of it right now. If this becomes law, has there been any research to see what type of impact this would have on the budget?
Okay, on one point on that is, one thing I thought I heard you saying was, what happens if they're all of a sudden retiring and now they're on the pension system? That's a legitimate question, though there's so few of them, really, in the grand scheme of things, that I don't think it would. And again, with an 8-year grandfathering period, they would be petering out. As time goes on. So I don't think that would have an impact. But there is a big question about the fiscal impact. As I mentioned before in this last question, that there's an argument that says term limited lawmakers will be less responsible with the budget. They'll spend more now than in the long term because they're not going to be here in the long term. And there's an argument on the other side too that says, well, non-term limited ones care more about re-election, and so they'll give the farm away in order to stay in office. And 2 years is all that matters. 4 years be damned. Maybe both those forces are at work and they've canceled themselves out, but the studies show that that doesn't really have a lot of impact.
Will they serve an 8-year instead of a lifetime? Will they be entitled to a full-time pension once they?
It'll be less. It would be less because there's a period in the pension system where you get vested that you get anything, and then every pension system is a little bit different, but generally you have to be in a certain period of time to get anything. Then you're vested, and after that, your payout depends on the length of time you've been in that position, and so there'll be a shorter period, so it will be less.
Thank you.
Thanks.